Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and in the interest of getting this important legislation passed, so we can get it to the next stage and provide these protections for workers. I could give a 20-minute speech, but I'll be giving a significantly shorter speech on this. But one other personal note that I wanted to add. I was texted this morning after I'd completed my speech that my first niece was born today. So her name's Maeve Elizabeth Danielle Penner, and so her mom's doing great, and we're all very happy and very blessed to have this new beautiful baby girl in our family. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise to Bill S3. It's an act to amend the Offshore Health and Safety Act. And I say I'm pleased to speak on this bill because it's about time that this important legislation to protect the safety of workers made its way through the House of Commons. Now, the Liberal government failed to get this legislation passed in a timely manner, and it has put the safety of offshore workers at risk. Now, we debate a lot of important issues in this House, but out of the many pieces of legislation that I have seen this government put forward over the past 2 years, few bills could be more important than ensuring the safety of workers. And in this case, we're talking about offshore energy workers. How did we get to this point, where we are now in a situation where important safeguards have been allowed to lapse? Safeguards last put in place by a previous Conservative government over 5 years ago, but not acted upon by this Liberal government until it was too late. Now, thankfully, no one appears to have been harmed by the lack of action on this file, but it remains inexcusable that we have come to this point in the first place. At the end of last year, the Liberals allowed the existing temporary safety regulations for our offshore oil and gas workers to expire, in effect stripping key health and safety protections for these Canadian workers who risk their lives every day to ensure that we have the resources we need to heat our homes, to drive our vehicles to work. Now, these workers, in this case primarily from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, are a pillar supporting the economy of the province and this country. Now, this province has elected a lot of Liberal MPs. The Minister of Natural Resources himself comes from the province, and yet it appears that so little attention has been paid to this important issue. Now, most people wouldn't know it, but I had the privilege of working in our onshore energy sector. I donned my personal protective equipment, my H2S monitor, and went to work in Canada's energy industrial heartland in Edmonton, Alberta. I spent 2 summers in university working the shutdowns at the Imperial Oil Refinery in Strathcona. And on site, we had plenty of heavy equipment moving around. We did the jobs that needed to be done to ensure the facility could run smoothly and create jobs and support our economy. I remember working the night shifts, 12 hours a day, day in, day out for weeks. I picked up extra hours at the end of each shift, put on a high-vis vest to do traffic control, and ensure that the tired workers wouldn't get accidentally run over as they went home from their shifts. I stood watch as skilled workers went deep into systems to ensure that first aid would be readily available for them in case of danger. Now, this was on the land, Mr. Speaker. I can only imagine the dangers of those on the East Coast who get on a helicopter and head out to platforms far at sea, sometimes in bad weather. Now, tragedies from our past demonstrate just how critical it is for these safety regulations to be in place. Back in 1982, Canadians were devastated by the news of the Ocean Ranger rig, where 84 workers lost their lives when it capsized during a storm. Or as we saw with Cougar Helicopter Flight 491, when it crashed into the North Atlantic, resulting in the tragic death of 17 offshore oil workers. In fact, it was this tragedy that led to the Cougar Inquiry, the results of which were taken by governments to pass this important legislation. And after each of these disasters, there were investigations into the cause and recommendations on how to avert these dangers again. And I'm sure there were politicians who spoke to the devastated families, promising that never again would this be allowed to happen. And yet here we are today, debating legislation that should have been passed months, if not years ago. You know, it was the previous Conservative government that recognized the very real need for these protections. That's why in 2014, the government passed safety regulations through the Offshore Health and Safety Act. And that is exactly the kind of leadership that we need in this country, a government that is proactive and not reactive, that takes prompt action to protect the safety of our workers. Now, these temporary regulations were set to expire in 2019, gave the Liberal government years to implement a permanent offshore energy safety regulations. Well, the Liberals had to extend that deadline for another year. They extended those temporary regulations to December 31st of 2020. The Liberals had the time, Mr. Speaker, to get the job done. For many of those years, they had a majority. And the fact is, even now in this minority government, they have the political support to get the job done. But they didn't, until now. And that's inexcusable. It was not days, it was not the month of the deadline in December that the Liberal government finally introduced Bill S3 in the Senate, in the other place. Where was their sense of urgency? It really feels like an afterthought, as if the safety of these workers was not of great importance to this government. Why did the Prime Minister, the Minister of Natural Resources, and this Liberal government wait until the last minute to do their jobs? An important deadline has been missed. Key protections are missing. The Liberal government dithers. Now, perhaps if the government had not chosen to prorogue the Parliament and waste many additional days of productive debate, we could have had this passed before the deadline. We will never know. But what we do know for sure is that the Liberal government did not care to make this a priority. Now, I'm also disappointed that this legislation was not introduced until last year for another reason. It would have been a fitting tribute to Judge Wells from Newfoundland and Labrador, who did so much to advocate for the safety of offshore workers. Sadly, in October of 2020, Judge Wells, who headed the Cougar inquiry, passed away at the age of 87. Judge Wells was a former progressive Conservative cabinet minister, provincially, a Rhodes Scholar, and as commissioner, his key contributions to the inquiry were the recommendations that helicopters have 30 minutes or more of dry run capability, and he also recommended founding a full search and rescue base in St. John's. Now, I wish the government had their act together and had passed this legislation in advance of the deadline, so that Judge Wells could have seen his legacy put permanently into action. But all the same, I want to commend him for his service to our country and to his province, and he will be remembered for his commitment to the welfare of offshore energy workers and their families. Now, the delayed passage of Bill S3 is just another example of how this Liberal government has failed to prioritize the needs of the men and women who work in our oil and gas sector. In fact, I noted with some surprise that the minister said one of three oil-producing Canadian provinces, seemingly unaware that there are more than 3 provinces in this country that produce oil. Now, if it wasn't bad enough that this government was failing to get key safety legislation passed by the deadline, they also seem intent on phasing out the livelihoods of these oil and gas workers. When we know that Newfoundland and Labrador relies on the energy sector more than every other province, including Alberta, we know that the future of Newfoundland and Labrador requires a strong offshore oil and gas sector. In fact, it is so important to that province that the word oil is mentioned nearly 150 times in the recent Green Report outlining the economic future of Newfoundland and Labrador. Yet this Liberal government continues their attack on the oil sector with bills like C-69 and C-48 in the previous Parliament, and by not acting on key legislation like S3 that we are debating today. You know, something close to 147 days have passed since the Liberal delays allowed for the existing legislation to expire. That's 147 days that hard-working offshore oil and gas workers have been left in limbo without protections. Now, I want to recognize the hard work done by those in the other place in passing Bill S3 as expediently as possible, recognizing the urgency of this bill. It is unacceptable that after passing the Senate so quickly, that this bill waited in the lineup to get through the House of Commons agenda. Certainly, we knew that members in this House were intent to get this legislation through quickly, at second reading, passed immediately. I sit on the Natural Resources Committee, and we moved with unprecedented speed to get this bill through. It was one meeting. And it is my sincere hope that we can push forward with this debate today and get this bill passed and secure these key protections for our offshore oil and gas workers. As members of this House, protecting Canadian workers must be a key priority. And that's why Conservatives have been cooperative in working to get this bill passed as quickly as possible. The failure to protect offshore energy workers is unconscionable and must end. It's time that we finally get the job done, secure these protections, so that these workers can continue going about their jobs safely, and so that we can ensure the prosperity and future of not only Newfoundland and Labrador, but of our nation, Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments?